And Abby to come and bring God's word to us this morning.
Thank you, Weston. Good morning, Faith. I'm excited to be here and super excited to look out on this enormous crowd. I'm overwhelmed, actually, by the size of the crowd this morning because last time I preached was on February 10th. I just want to invite you into what that day looked like. And that's the outside of the church. I want to show you the inside that morning. There was the crowd. So on February 10th is the Great Snow Apocalypse 2019. We shut down the live services and we live streamed, which was awesome. Speaking of the tech ministry, we were able to do that. There was about 75 to 100 that braved the storm. We canceled the services, but we did say, hey, we would like a live studio audience. And if there was some people that could walk here or get in their four-wheel drive vehicle to come over here, but Jeff and the team were able to provide live streaming. How many of you remember being here? You were actually on site that morning. Okay, one. No, you weren't in the picture. So there was a few of us. I thought it was going to be like the 95 Yankees-Mariners series where everybody's hand went up. They had like only 50,000 there, but 2 million actually said that they were there. So how many of you remember live streaming it, though? Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, I remember it was one of the more memorable for me, sermons that I've ever did. Maybe not memorable for you at all. But it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing it that way and having a small and intimate crowd. It reminded me of like my first days as a youth pastor as well. Just a small crowd that was gathered there. And it was, I think we were in Philippians back then. Today, we're diving back into our Red Letters series, which is looking at passages where Jesus specifically spoke and taught the crowds. Well, obviously we have God's Word, which teaches us God's principles and values and His commands for us, but we have some specific words that in your old school Bibles are the red letter sections. These are actual quotes from Jesus to the crowds, to His disciples, and ultimately to us. And so today we're going to be looking at a segment in Luke chapter 6. And to give you a little bit of context, we'll start, basically, and we're going to look at 20 through 26, but I'm going to give you a little bit of the background here in 12 through 16. So just to give you a little bit of that background, in these days he went to the mountain to pray. This is talking about Jesus, and he alone went and prayed to God the Father. And coming as a result of that, after all night of praying, he gathered his disciples. Quick note that his disciples at this point, it's all that were following Jesus. And at this point, he's taking that group, let's say it's 100 plus, and he's saying, here are the 12 whom he named. And so he starts with verse 14 with Simon and ends there in verse 16 with Judas Iscariot, who became the traitor. Dun, dun, dun. Our context is that Jesus chose the 12. These are the people that he gave the power and the authority, the apostolos authority, which was a judicial term, which means I'm giving these 12, the apostolos authority, meaning wherever you go and speak, you're actually speaking on behalf of me. So there's a difference between a disciple, a follower of Jesus, and those that he gave apostleship. And so this is where Jesus had done this very early in his earthly ministry. But can you imagine how these guys felt? And I know that Chris has given us some background these first couple weeks of the series, but these are not 12 that you would expect to be chosen. In fact, they really didn't qualify to be chosen. A couple weeks ago, Chris taught on a young Jewish boy. His education would literally be to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. And I have a hard time memorizing 5 verses sometimes. Jesus wept. Pray continually. The 2-verse ones are really easy for me, okay? And 2-word ones are easy for me. But these guys memorized all of that. And maybe some of the apostles had done an okay job of memorizing some. But these are guys that some of them were related to each other. So they may not have even liked each other because they were related to each other. Some of them had worked together. They were fishermen. Some of them were despised. Like we talked about Levi, Matthew, last week. And he was a tax collector. And most of us don't like tax collectors. Apologies to anybody in here who works for the IRS. So here's somebody who, or these 12 that are chosen. If you remember PE class or recess when you're in elementary, and some of you are going into PTSD now, I get it, and a selection of the kickball team, and not being chosen until the last round and feeling that. And some of you are like, no, I was always the first round draft choice. I asked Will coming home from recess. He's a sixth grader now, head of the school. And so I was like, hey, were you, they call it, instead of captain, they call it cap. I was first cap. And I was like, were you a captain today? No. And I said, were you the first round draft choice? Yeah, Dad. Yeah, of course. Sixth grader, he has to be. So these 12 may have felt pretty darn special for finally being chosen. And at some point in your life, I guess that most of us can relate to that feeling of being chosen and it being kind of special. I remember in college, I felt chosen. My freshman year, I go down to Southern California for school, and it was during that first week that some guys, older guys in the school, invited me to go on a night hike with them. It was Friday night. These juniors and seniors offer this trip to this lowly freshman. And I went and hung out with these guys. We drove, and we show up, and we start walking along this train track. And anybody who's ever gone walking on a train track, you understand that it's awkward already because it's like every 3 feet is so you're either taking long strides or you're doing the individual steps. And so we're walking, and the guys start asking me about my testimony. I had trusted in Jesus 1 year prior. And so I was like, man, these guys care. This is so cool. And I start opening up my heart to them. And then the opening was there, and that was a train tunnel that we decided to walk into at 10 o'clock at night in the dark with no flashlight. Or actually, I had a flashlight. I felt pretty cool because I had my big mag light. I was going to protect everybody. And so we start walking into this train tunnel, and the lights of L.A. were providing the light for the tunnel for about the first 100 or 200 yards. And all of a sudden, that light got smaller and smaller and smaller. And it was like this pinpoint. If you look at the doors that you could see in front of you or on the side of you, that's all the light that I could see, but it was dark in LA, so you got the city lights only, and so this little light got smaller and smaller and smaller, and we're just talking, having a good time, and then all of a sudden I trip, and I fall. There was a boulder or something that like jumped out at me. Well, it didn't really jump out at me, but I tripped, and I'm like, you guys, I fell, and ouch, this hurts, and they're like, what happened? I was like, I tripped over a rock or something. They're like, there's no rocks on the tracks. And so I said, well, let me get my flashlight. And like, no, and I was like, let me check, and it was a dog's head. Just a skull, no body, and sorry if I gross anybody out. PG-13 sermon, cover your ears. And I thought, this happened to a dog. This could happen to us. Poor Ruffles. I don't want to be Ruffles. And I was like, you guys, we got to get out of here. They're like, no, don't worry. There's never trains in here. And so we kept walking, and the light got really smaller and smaller and smaller. And then all of a sudden, the light got really, really bright, and the noise got really, really loud. And that was from this end. And all of a sudden, this poosh, big light and blaring noise of a train. Ooh, ooh. And so you guys are all thinking the same thing that I'm thinking right now. And what is that? Run. Yes, we should run, shouldn't we? And I was like, run! And they're like, yeah! And they all jump for joy and start running towards the light. I'm not a junior or senior. I don't have this kind of wisdom. I'm just a freshman. No! They're like, come on, Brian! And they literally, all I can see is a silhouette of these guys running and jumping towards death. Or so I thought. And we'll come back to that story in a little bit. I like cliffhangers, okay? So, a little bit more of our context. Getting back to our scripture. You're here for this scripture, not for Brian's stories, okay? So here's the deal. We're going to tell an awesome story about Jesus. Okay, so after he chose the 12, it says this, and he came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured, and all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all. I love just thinking about that. Like, if I was there that day, and like, what would it look like to see power coming out from him? In Acts chapter 2, seeing the tongues of fire. There's some things in Scripture that I'm just like, oh man, I wish that we could have experienced that or can experience that. And I think that we can. We'll get to that in just a little bit. So now that we have a little bit of the context, we're about to dive into the actual red letter section from Jesus. But I want to give you a spoiler alert. Those of you that are like, hey, I don't want to hear how the outcome comes. I believe in teaching and saying, hey, here's where we're going, and I'm going to give you the end point right now. But I'm afraid if I do that, some of you might leave in 5 minutes when I'm done with that part. But so just stick with it. But if you are, anybody in here, the person that's like, don't give me a spoiler alert to a movie or to a sports score or something like, okay, there's 4 of you in here. But I'm that guy, like a 10 o'clock service, 10 o'clock Seahawk game. If I'm here for the 10:30 service, it's like, you all better be quiet and not tell me anything, because DVR is awesome. This Friday, that happened to me. A couple years ago, got to go to Australia and train a bunch of youth workers. And while I was over there, I got treated to an Australian rules football game. And my Richmond Tigers, yes, they are my Richmond Tigers. I got to see Richmond and Collingwood play in a match at the MCG, which none of you even know what that. There's a few of you that know what it is. But the Melbourne, it's pronounced Melbourne, not Melbourne, Melbourne Cricket Grounds. And Friday morning at 2:30 a.m. is when Richmond played in the semifinal game before the grand final this week, and we won. But I did not want to know that when I woke up, so I had to avoid social media. World problems, for sure. And so I avoided it because I didn't want the spoiler alert. So those of you, just by context, you can close your ears and your mouth, and, well, keep your mouth closed anyway, but close your eyes and ears just over the next 30 seconds as I go over this little context before we dive into the red letters. So here's the setting, the who, what, where, why, when, and I'm actually going to give my end point during this too. So who? Jesus and 3 types of people. The apostles, a large crowd of his disciples. Again, remember, Jesus has now separated the apostles from the whole group of the disciples, but everybody's gathered there, and a great number of people. So that's the who. The what, a call. This is the end point where you should be covering your ears if you don't want to hear the last point, but the call to an exceptional love in light of God's extravagant grace. If you don't take anything from this morning's sermon, it's that we are to have an extravagant, or an exceptional love that flows from us because of his exceptional grace. Because of his extravagant grace, I should say. Who, what, where? This was at a level place. You're like, oh, that's a big deal. But likely in a mountainous region, okay? And it is actually a big deal because in the research, there's some scholars that believe that this sermon in Luke chapter 6 is the same sermon as Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. But here it says Jesus is on a level place, okay? There are level places in mountainous regions. So this may be a truism that this message is the same sermon that Jesus delivered that Matthew recorded in his gospel, and now Luke is recording it in his gospel. But other scholars believe it was 2 separate things, that Jesus actually taught the same thing twice. Can you believe it? A pastor doing the same story twice? Crazy. It's almost like I did this like an hour ago. But people in first service may hear it a little bit differently than people in second service. So I'm kind of the mindset that maybe Jesus did the same teachings multiple times. And it's not a huge deal, except for us to understand this setting. Because Matthew, it says that Jesus sat. See, Matthew had more of a Jewish audience. And so it says that Jesus sat to teach. A rabbi would often, when it was a formal setting, would sit to teach. In Luke, it says he stood and he taught. In Luke's context, Luke is more of the evangelist, and he wants Jew and Gentile to understand the message. So it's maybe just one way that Matthew remembered it, and Luke remembered it, and they can be reconciled that way. So the who, the what, the where, the why. Okay, why for Jesus? Why did he deliver this message? And I think it was to level the playing field for all humankind. Because if you remember who was there, you have the crowd there. You have the disciples there, and among the disciples you have the apostles. And Jesus, in this message, essentially says, it doesn't really matter what your status is. Everybody has to understand their place in the kingdom. Everybody, there is no one righteous, not even one. All of you must come to the Father through the Son. And this was like countercultural message for the Jews, obviously, because they have earned, essentially, they have been called the chosen people, and then they've, through the law, been able to continue to live in that grace that God has given them. But this is a brand new message for Gentiles. Why for the people? Why were they there? They were there to listen to his teaching and to be healed. There were some that had heard about Jesus doing these great healings, so they're like bringing their friends, and they say, you got to come, you got these unclean spirits, let's have Jesus cast this out. And that was their motivation, was healing. There was others that were like, man, I want to know more from this great teacher. I want to apply these truths. And I think about our church. There's different motivations for some of you being here this morning. There's some that are saying, man, this is a long and faithful path. I just want to learn more from God's word. There's others in here that are saying, man, I don't really know this faith yet. I'm checking things out. I love that there's a hodgepodge of people this morning that gathered to hear Jesus, just as there's a hodgepodge of people here that are gathering. And I don't know what your motivation is, but Jesus is addressing the entire crowd in this moment. And the last one is the when. It's at the very beginning of the apostles' ministry. Right after they've been called, this is the very first teaching that Jesus does. And so maybe the way that they heard it, maybe what they saw Jesus do made a profound impact on how they basically moved into their ministry as well. So now we get to our actual text for the day in Luke chapter 6, 20 through 26. It says this, and he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy. For behold, your reward is great in heaven, for so their fathers did to the prophets. Understanding the context is very key. These statements from the Sermon on the Plateau, that's what they've nicknamed this one, not the Sermon on the Mount, but the Sermon on the Plateau, though they could be heard differently and individually by each person that was gathered there, was describing the overall status for those who were choosing the kingdom. They were people that were part of the kingdom, and these are the statements of blessings for their current state. This is the beginning. The blessings he's addressing not for individual types of people, though somebody might say, hey, I am of the poor. He's talking to me. Or I am of the hungry. He's talking to me. But more he's saying, hey, this is a compilation of a type of person, and that is the person who has chosen kingdom, who is following me. In choosing to follow Jesus, many have become poor and become hungry. They become sad and they become hated. Yet the promise of Jesus is that this is a temporary state compared to their eternal blessing that will be experienced on earth and or heaven. It's some of them are experiencing those blessings even now, and others are suffering in such a way that they won't experience it until their kingdom. But it's a positional statement from Jesus. You are this. You are poor, but you are blessed. You are hungry, but you are blessed because you're a follower of me. The blessings listed can be seen as progressive in nature as well. One naturally leading to the next. Poor, hungry, sad, spurned. It's important to note that these are stated as positional facts, not if-then statements. It's not, if you are poor, then yours is the kingdom. It's more of a, because you're following me, you are among the poor, the hungry, the sad, and the persecuted, and you will be satisfied. Your need is ultimately taken care of. Many who have gathered, who have come to that place, have come from a place of curiosity, of dissatisfaction, and of desperation. Jesus' words would have had many scratching their head. The crowd that had gathered, when they hear these words, they were so countercultural. They literally would have been like me in the train tunnel. You guys remember that story? I told you that I'd come back to it. Ooh, finally. So here's the train, the glaring light coming towards us, and us running towards it, and the loud noise. I mean, it was loud. If you've ever been in a train tunnel, I hope that you haven't. and this is not an invitation to you teenagers to do this, okay? But as we're running towards this, and I'm thinking, what are we doing? What are we doing? And everyone's jumping for joy and everything. They are sprinting towards this thing, and so I'm doing the stupid thing too, and I'm just sprinting with them, and then I trip for a second time. Again, I'm a freshman, okay? And I go down, and as I come back up, the guys like basically grab me and kind of hug me, and they're laughing, and all I'm seeing is this huge light coming at us. I'm like, what are we doing? We got to go the other way. And they pull me to the side. They pull me to the side wall of the train tunnel, because about every 100 feet is one of these. This little alcove, this little refuge. It was about 8 feet wide and about 4 feet deep, and the 6 or 7 of us could easily fit into that alcove. And we did, and they're laughing at me, and I'm feeling wet. I'm not sure if it's because I fell in a puddle or because I created the puddle, if you know what I'm talking about. And they're just laughing, and I'm just breathing heavy, and I'm like, guys, what's going on? And they're like, we knew that these were here. And we sat there as this train went by about 10 minutes later at about 2.5 miles per hour. Chugga, 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 chugga. And I felt so stupid that my sophomore, junior, and senior year, I did that same thing to some other freshmen. It was awesome. True discipleship. You pass on what you've learned from others, right? It was a great practical joke to have played on other people later, but it was kind of a cool little life lesson for me. And that countercultural aspect of what Jesus taught literally was this head-scratching moment. That second that I heard and saw that train, and they ran towards. It's because they knew there was a place of refuge. They knew that there was an alcove. They knew that ultimately they were safe, but they also knew that God's message was counterculture. We're not supposed to run towards a big light. And yet they did it because they knew and had the security of what was there. Even though our natural thought is to find escape, to find comfort, and to find provision on our own. What had been taught to me and been modeled to me is literally, hey, run for safety the other way. You can do this on your own. You can escape. You can do this. And I feel like that's kind of an overall message of the Beatitudes here. Is that those that are poor in spirit, those that are hungry, those that you understand your desperation, and you understand that you can't do it on your own. Something had to be provided for you, versus those that have security in themselves, in their finances, in their security of popularity or status in life, and you're doing that on your own. That leads us to the second part, the woes or the warnings. Verse 24 through 26 says, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did to the false prophets." The four woes match and contrast the earlier blessings. These indicate Jesus' warning against those who are uncaring about those around them and who are insensitive to the things of God. It's important for us to note that, like the blessings are not looking at four different people groups or four different types of people, they are four related descriptions of a certain type of person. The series of woes shows the spiritual condition of the people who believe they have it all already, who have arrived. Jesus' red letters are essentially stating, you have gotten your reward now. Be warned, the kingdom is different. The weak, the poor, the hungry, and the desperate will actually win. But do we see ourselves as those? I mean, I have felt poor. I talked about being in college, right? I felt poor in those days. I've experienced hunger. In fact, it's 11:22, and I'm experiencing that a little bit. Or I had too much coffee this morning. It's gurgling down there, okay? I've been sad, and I've wept. I've even been made fun of for following Jesus. However, I've also had some pretty serious wake-up calls when I realized none of those are really true of me. I haven't really felt those things. I've had that wake-up call, and in fact, in 2000, I had a real wake-up call, and this is in India. That's baby Brian and baby Elizabeth there. A little warn. I'm sorry, I forgot to warn my wife that I'm going to show this picture. So that's Joseph. That's there with us, and Joseph became a pretty special friend. See, Joseph was raised as an orphan in India. He was rescued from the streets in India as like a 3 or 4 year old little boy who had been abused and neglected and been a beggar, and he was rescued by Emmanuel Ministries, and he was raised in Kota, India, to be part of God's orphan army. See, the kids that went to Emmanuel Ministries were raised by Christian teachers and Christian parents in this orphanage, and given a hope and given a future and given food and given clothing and raised so that when they were about 18, 19 years old and graduated from seminary, because 16 through 18-year-old boys would go to seminary, and they would get their diploma, but they'd also be given a bike and a bicycle and a destination. And they were raised to be God's orphan army of planting churches in places like Bundi. And see, Joseph is 20 years old at this time, and he was our tour guide. He was working for Emmanuel Ministries now, and he picked us up in Delhi, and we had a couple days trip on a tourist bus down to Kota before we were doing our ministry. The spring before, the founder's son of the ministry had come over to the United States, and I had met him, and he met my high school youth group. I was a youth pastor, and he said, "Brian, your group is really mature. Can you bring a high school group over?" And I said, "Have you had a high school group before?" And he said, "No, we've had college groups." He said, "But I like your group. Can you bring them over?" I said, "Yeah, it'd be awesome." So we took, parents were crazy those days. I would never send my kids to a place like South Africa without, anybody. Sorry, they're having a South Africa meeting right now for our students, but... So I took 8 students and 7 adults from our church over to Kota, and this is the first couple days of the trip. We had just gotten to know Joseph, and it was a culture shock thing, and we show up at the Taj Mahal on day 2. And we took this picture, and then right after this picture, we literally started walking towards the Taj to go to the Taj Mahal. And I'm walking along, and I didn't know these cultural things. And as I'm walking... you need to know that in India, men show friendship by holding hands. And so as I'm walking with my hand in my pocket, all of a sudden there was another hand in my pocket, and it wasn't Elizabeth. I've never seen 8 high schoolers grab their cameras any faster. That was before digital cameras happened. And so they're all taking these pictures, and I'm like, whoa, whoa. And Joseph's like, "Oh, sorry, Brian, this is a sign of friendship that we hold hands. You are my friend." And I'm telling you, it's a friendship that has lasted forever. In fact, this week I was invited to go over to India. I'm not able to make it, but to go over there where Joseph, who has now become the director of Mason's Place, it's an orphanage for girls that were rescued from slavery and sex slavery and are now being raised to be God's orphan army in their school there. And they're doing some huge renovations for their kitchen, and I was invited to go and celebrate that, where Joseph is the director there. And I'm hoping that God opens up the door in 2020 for me to go over there. I learned so much about the kingdom when I was on this trip. So many of my presuppositions and my perceptions were rocked. I saw how rich I am, how I've never actually experienced hunger. The things that made me sad have mostly paled in comparison to what I experienced and saw in India. And the persecution I faced is nothing compared to what it looks like for most believers in India. I've never seen poverty. I've been to a lot of third world countries even since. But I've never seen poverty like I saw in India. But I've never seen hope and security and joy like I've seen in India as well, for those that are hungry and those that are sad and those that are persecuted. See, going into the trip, we asked the question of M.A. Thomas and Samuel Thomas, the founders, who said, "Can you bring your group over?" I said, how can we help? And they gave some ways that we can help, and in the last morning, we got to do it in a pretty special way. Our last morning, full day, was Christmas in Kota. And after a week of serving kind of in vacation Bible school we gave the teachers a break, and we served as teachers in the seminary. But on the last morning, we got to celebrate on Christmas morning with the church, and we got to serve the church. And we were notified the night before that we were going to hand out hundreds of blankets to the lepers in the community there in Coda. And so in the morning, I woke up and I got up early and was getting my cup of coffee, and I walked outside. And churches are a little different. There was like up on the second or third floor where the actual meeting was, and there was a downstairs kind of garage open area where we knew that we were going to do the distribution of the blankets. And so I saw, as I came out, there was already a line at like 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning of lepers that were ready. And there was a woman that caught my eye immediately. On the way to Coda, we had stopped at a couple leper colonies, so I'd seen leprosy and saw the skin disease. And this woman was on a coaster cart, one of those little slabs of wood with 4 coasters. Like, you remember elementary PE and those little coasters that you'd go around on, you'd run over your fingers and it would hurt a lot. And so that's what she was on, and she was scooting herself, and she was at the front of the line. And I saw her, and she caught my eye, and I said, "Namaste," and she said, "Namaste." And we had just this brief exchange, and I felt true friendship and acceptance, and I hope that she felt true friendship and acceptance, and it was just this moment. And then we got to go worship with the Indian church, and it was time. And during church service, somebody had pulled us aside and said, "Know that there's going to be a TV crew. Indian TV is going to come and capture you guys doing this." The white people handing blankets and gifts of mercy to these lepers. And so we gathered downstairs, and by the time we got down there was a line not just through this garage, but out the city blocks. I mean, it was hundreds of people. And the TV crews are there, and our kids got to hug people and hand them a blanket and share Jesus and pray with these people that were receiving these blankets. The first 10 minutes, the camera crew captures all of this, and then they leave, and we get to continue to distribute these gifts to these people. An hour and a half goes by as we're handing these out, and we're seeing the blankets go down and go down and go down, and to the point where there were still 30 or 40 people in line, and we're out of blankets. And our kids are so sad, and our adults on the trip are thinking we can go upstairs and get our clothing and hand it to, or hand rupees to them or dollars, and we're like, no. And the director, Joseph, said, "No, don't do that." And we just had to say sorry to people, and then it hit me. I never saw my friend. I never saw that woman. And so I asked one of the people in charge, I said, "Hey, there's a woman that was here that was in the front of the line a couple hours ago, and I didn't see her." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Brian." And he went over, and there was this little kind of storage closet room where he opened the door, and 7 or 8 people came out on crutches and wheelchairs and the coaster. They were put into storage. He said they're from a lower caste. They don't deserve a blanket. The TV crews couldn't capture you doing that because that's not acceptable. I was rocked. Sometimes we need wake-up calls to understand our call to exceptional love in light of God's extravagant grace. Jesus' message to the crowds, a crowd like this, people that are gathered and just listening to a countercultural message. This is what that day looked like. Just lines of people that were waiting for a simple gift of a blanket. Jesus' message to the crowds in the Sermon on the Plateau was countercultural. It was not the rich, the powerful, or the satisfied who were blessed, but those who were poor, hungry, and persecuted, who are ultimately happy, because those are the ones who understand the source. They understand that they can't make it on their own. The desperate understand depravity and understand we can't do it on our own, and we must rely upon God and others. So what can we do with this countercultural message applied 2,000 years later? And I want to look at just some simple applications. What can we do in light of God's extravagant grace in our life? And the first one is this. That's to come to Jesus. In June of 1990, I didn't know Jesus. And I was striving for acceptance from my friends and through sports and through having girls like me. And I was invited to a camp where I got to hear about God's extravagant grace. And the story of the prodigal son rocked my world because I understood that I was the prodigal. I'm the one who has left and abandoned my family. And just like Adam and Eve, though God desired relationship with me, I had turned my back on him. And there's sins that I have done and I have committed that have separated me, and there's been sins that have been done to me that have caused me bitterness and caused me separation and caused me to not want to do with anything with other people. But I understood that it was by choice that I said, I can do this on my own, and I can solve my way back. And it was there that I understood that I can't do it on my own. I got to the place of desperation that nothing that I can do can actually be good enough. And while I was yet a sinner, Christ died for me. And maybe that is you today, that you came and you're just part of the crowd, but you're hearing a message of God's grace that he says, you know what, you are worthy. Chose this for you. And yes, I understand that you believe that you're defined by your sin or the sins that have been done against you. But you can, in your place of desperation, you can receive this amazing grace, and it is for you. And if that is you, I would love to have a conversation with you afterwards, or maybe your neighbor next to you, you know and you trust that they're a believer, and you say, I want to have that freedom. I'm at that place of desperation, and I desire that relationship. For some of us, it's a wake up to Jesus. It's like, hey, I've understood this, and I've been a part of a church, and yet, you know what? These reminders today are causing me to wake up. And I understand that though I trusted in his grace then for forgiveness and for my salvation, I'm living out of my quantity and out of my provision for self. And I need to get back to that place of desperation, understanding that I can't do anything on my own, but I need God's help and I need others. And maybe it's a surrender to you going, you know what, I'm trying to attack this storm on my own. And you not only need to invite Jesus in, but you need to invite a friend in, a family member in, and saying, I'm captured by this sin, or I can't overcome this bitterness or this obstacle, and I need somebody else to carry this burden with me. Galatians 6:2 says that we are to carry each other's burdens. We're all built to carry a load, and anything above that load becomes a burden. And Christians, we are to carry the burden of somebody else. So maybe that's our wake-up call, to do countercultural things. And the last one is to be the representation of Jesus in very practical ways. To represent Jesus in a very practical way, to do countercultural things. I don't know if you know of countercultural things, but one thing that I do know is that we're almost all of us are addicted to these things. Okay, and we find ourselves doing this. A lot of you may have seen the montage, the pictures this week of an artist who took away phones and captured pictures of people. You should get on your phone and look at those pictures. No, understand I'm giving you the wrong message right now, but it was pretty powerful. These black and white pictures of somebody barbecuing and having their phone here at a dinner table, and people privately looking in their lap as a family. And I'm going, oh my gosh, that's my family. That's me. And Elizabeth and I have the opportunity this Thursday. Seattle Christian School has asked us to come and present on kids, teens, and screens. And what I've realized over these last couple of weeks of studying for this is that I'm a hypocrite. And I need to wake up, and I need to do countercultural things because my kids are seeing mom and dad model that this rules. They're desperate for the attention of mom and dad, and we're saying, hey, can you go to the video babysitter? Because I've got work to do, and I've got money to make so that I can provide for my family, and they're saying, provide for me by being with me and being present. And so we get the opportunity to teach on that, and it's going to be somewhat countercultural. I'm learning so much about the mind of an 11 to 15-year-old, and literally the mind is being shaped, like literally physically shaped by digital, the whole aspect of digital natives. It's a different culture, and I have to educate myself and know how to be a missionary to that culture. I want to be the representation of Jesus to help a crowd of parents and adults understand that what they've been influenced by, these teens and what we've been influenced by, we just see as bad and as wrong rather than look to engage. And I feel like those that were gathered and hearing a countercultural message just got mad at those that weren't like them and got mad at Jesus' teaching rather than what Jesus modeled, and that's to come alongside and to be present and to learn. So countercultural might mean understanding your neighbor so that you can share Jesus with your neighbor, understanding the lost so that you can enter in and meet practical needs, and partnering with other people. And this is my real place of application. What if instead of asking somebody how you can help them, what if we look to partner with people in meeting other people's needs? This is a principle I learned. I have a really cool job. My job is to help churches find pastors when they've resigned or been moved on. And so churches will hire me and the organization I work for to help. And a couple weeks ago I was in Colorado, and I got to meet the senior pastor that we're moving into a brand new building. I literally had building envy. I'm going to tell you, I was jealous. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so nice. They took over like what used to be a Cabela's, 91,000 square feet. They're going to move in at Christmas. They've taken down all the deer heads and stuff, don't worry. But this building is just phenomenal. And so the senior pastor took us on a tour of this building. And I'm walking in, I'm looking at the youth room. I used to be a youth pastor. I'm like, oh my gosh, so many kids are going to get saved here. It's so cool. And he said, I got one more special place I got to take you. I was thinking we're going to go into like his senior pastor office with like some jacuzzi tub or something. I don't know. And he takes us outside to the parking lot. And he said, here it is. I'm like, this is where our car is. And he said, yeah, this is my favorite spot. It's like, why? Countercultural. And he said, because look. And surrounding the parking lot of the church were all these apartment buildings. He said, God's moving us to this neighborhood. It was only a mile from the old church. And he said, we're going to do something in the spring. He said, I'm equipping my people right now. Instead of going and knocking on the doors, I'm like, good, not a door knocking campaign. Nobody likes those. He said, instead of knocking on the doors and asking, he's like, they are going door to door. So they're going to go door to door and they're going to ask when the person answers. Instead of saying, how can I help you? They're going to say, do you know anybody that needs help? Just this subtle shift. Instead of saying, hey, I have something that you need, I can be the one who helps you, he's equipping his people to go and say, do you know? And so he goes to the Smith's house and knocks on the door, and the Smiths open. They're like, hey, we're from the church here. Do you happen to have a relationship with anybody who needs help? Because we want to partner with you. It's empowering somebody there. Now, some of them are going to say, I can't, I need help. They They're going to be bold enough to say that. But a lot of people are going to go, hey, this isn't threatening. Yeah, I do. My sister, she lives in an apartment, a couple miles from here, and she can't pay her rent next month. And they're going to take that message back to the church, and together with the church, they're going to go, hey, let's partner with this person to see if we can meet that need. The church is saying, we together as 1,000 people or 2,000 people in this church, we believe that God is going to provide because we're coming to him in a place of desperation. Because we can't meet this need on our own, we are going to partner with the people in the apartment to meet the needs of their friends. And he says, I have no idea where this is going to go. I have no idea how God's going to answer our prayer, but isn't it going to be so cool to see this journey? And I just thought, what if we did that in our own lives? And you're thinking about your Boeing coworker or the kid at your school. If you at lunch tomorrow in the cafeteria were to go up to somebody and just say, do you know anybody who needs help? Where would God take that? What would God do? We asked the question when we went to India, how can we help? Essentially saying, is there anybody that we can help? And God opened up the doors of our desperation to meet needs that we could never meet on our own, but that God included us in that story. How does God desire to use you, to use us in his story to meet others? Jesus, I would pray that you would open up many avenues for us to explore the application of your word, these red letters. God, I pray that we would come as desperate people understanding we can't do things on our own, but because of your extravagant and exceptional love, God, we desire to pour out that love and grace on others. Help us to do that in very practical ways this week. We pray this in Jesus' name.